Morning, Kingwood. Good to see you today. Welcome to church, everybody. In person here and online, welcome to church. Good to have you here. If you haven't done it yet, take out your phone and scan the QR code in front of you or on the screen. The top 3 things happening at Kingwood are there. Number 1 on the list is the One for One Club. And if you haven't joined the One for One Club, I want to invite you to do that today. And I'll tell you how you can do that and why you should do that. So the One for One Club is this. It is the discipleship on-ramp at Kingwood Church for stewardship, giving, and financial management and health. And so what we want to do is we want to do everything that we can do to disciple everyone at Kingwood in every way we can. And one of those ways is in stewardship. And so here's how the One for One Club works. Basically, when you sign up, you say, you know what I want to do? I want to give 1% or more of my income to God through Kingwood Church for a year. And so here's what happens. When you do that, you set in motion some resources that we have personally made for you. Like we've curated them, we've researched them, we've broken them down, and every month you're going to get a resource from our church that's going to help you grow in financial health. And so we're going to talk to you about getting out of debt. We're going to talk to you about saving. We're going to talk to you about investing. We're going to talk to you about giving. We're going to talk to you about budgeting. We're going to talk to you about all the areas of financial management that you need to know in order to get healthy. Now, you may say, hey, if you want everybody to get healthy, just send it to everybody. Here's why we don't. Because Jesus said, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. So if your heart's not in it, it doesn't matter. Jesus could come to earth and write the greatest principles of financial management anybody on earth has ever heard. But if your heart's not in it, you won't read it and you won't do it. So Jesus said, where your treasure is, your heart is also. So when you step across the line and say, you know what, I want to begin to invest in the kingdom of God, it pulls your heart into it. And when your heart's into it, the email that we send you, you'll actually open it. And you'll read it. And who knows, you might even start to apply some of it. And you might actually even start to benefit. So that's what we want to do. We want to invite you to join the One for One Club. It's real easy. You can sign up there. Number 2 on the top 3 list is 5:30 tonight. Right here in the sanctuary, in person only, is our monthly soak service. So I want to invite everybody to join us tonight for worship and prayer and ministry. We're going to be talking about the heart, issues of the heart, and we are going to be going deeper. I want to invite you to come out and seek God and seek His presence and to go deeper with us tonight at Soak. So join us for that. Now, this morning, we're continuing our series we've called Forgotten Virtues. And I want to talk specifically to those of you who may feel a little discouraged. And if you're actually honest, you may feel even more than a little discouraged. You may just feel like quitting. Maybe you had a dream and it doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen and you've gotten discouraged. Maybe there's some ministry or passion that God's put on your heart, but when you look at the road ahead, it seems like you're never going to get there. Maybe you've been praying for your children, your maybe teenage or adult children, and you've been praying and believing and praying and believing, and it doesn't matter what happens. It just seems like they're never going to follow Jesus. Maybe you're one of those people that you've battled with an addiction, and you've prayed and you've rededicated your life, and you've prayed and you rededicated your life, and you fought, and it just seems like you're never going to break through. It seems like the harder you try, the further from God that you get. You've done everything you know to do, but life is just too much. So for the person that's tried and prayed and believed and you don't know what else to do, God's got a word for you today. We're going to start in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 35 that says, so do not throw away your confidence. Somebody repeat that with me. Do not throw away your confidence. We're off to a good start, aren't we? It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. So we've called this series Forgotten Virtues because there are virtues in life that as a society we've kind of moved past, and we're saying, no, let's dig those up because they are good, they are godly, they're in Scripture, and good virtues build good character, and good character blesses you, and it blesses those close to you, and it honors God. And so we started with honor the first week. Last week we talked about integrity. Today we're going to talk about perseverance. And I can tell you right out of the gate, God is rarely ever early, but He's never late. And so I want to encourage you today in your own perseverance. There's an author named Angela Duckworth, and she studied at Harvard and Oxford and has a lot of educational background. And she decided to do some research on why people succeed. In other words, what is the difference between people who succeed and people who quit? So her and her team isolated 3 different groups of people. Young cadets who enter the military academy. Why do they persevere and keep going when others drop out? World-class spelling bee contestants. You know those people that spell words with about 83 letters in it? Can use it in a sentence and you go, no, I can't. I can't even pronounce it. And you have a 12-year-old up there spelling, you've seen this intense thing. What makes those people succeed while other people drop out? And then her and her team looked at teachers in inner city schools. What makes a teacher go into an inner city school and try to make a difference, and somewhere in the middle of the first semester say, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and they quit, while others stick to it and they teach year in and year out and year in and year out? And here's one of the things that they learned in their research. It was kind of surprising. It wasn't based on IQ. In other words, it wasn't based on how intelligent or smart someone was. It was based on what she called AQ, adversity quotient. Adversity quotient. What ability do you have to persevere through adversity? And out of her research, she wrote a book called Grit. Now, I know we're in the South. Not grits, not cheese grits, not cheddar cheese grits. Grit. And here's how she defines grit: the passion and perseverance to reach long-term goals. Not just the excitement. Anybody can be excited for a day. Anybody can say, oh yeah, woo, I'll be there, And then in a week you can't find them. Anybody can be excited in a moment, in an event, in a season, in a time. But it's not just passion, it's perseverance. It's not just short-term goals. It's not just things that are going to take a month to do. These are long-term goals. We're talking like families, parents who have raised special needs children who have to persevere for a long time. Someone who's battled a chronic illness year in and year out and year in and year out. And it's so complicated you can't even explain it. So you've given up trying to explain it and you just privately try to slug it out. It's trying to get out of debt year after year after year after year after year after year, and you just can't seem to get that mountain off of your back. We're talking about long-term adversity. We're talking about showing up when it's easier just to walk away. There's a story in the book of Joshua that helps us learn some things about perseverance that I want to show you today. Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. We're going to read a pretty long passage, 5 verses here. Chapter 6, 1 through 5. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go in or out. But the Lord said to Joshua, I've given you Jericho. For those of you who had any time in Sunday school or vacation Bible school, you know this story, right? The walls of Jericho came down, but don't pretend like you don't know the end. Lord said, I've given you Jericho, its king, all its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. So it's a parade. It's a big deal. On the 7th day, you're to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horn, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse and the people can charge straight into the town. Verse 6. So Joshua called together the priests and said, take up the ark of the Lord's covenant and assigned 7 priests to walk in front of it, each carrying a ram's horn. Then he gave orders to the people, march around the town, and the armed men will lead the way in front of the ark of the Lord. Now, here's what I want you to see out of the gate. God promised he would give to Israel the city of Jericho. He promised. He said, I've given it to you. Just do this. Now, here's the question. Why is it that we get discouraged, and why is it that we give up, and why is it that we quit when God has promised us so much? Because he has. Why do we quit? Let me give you some reasons that I see in this story that maybe you'll find yourself in one or two of them. Number one, our perspective is often limited. Here's the thing, historically, Jericho wasn't a big city. You could walk around the entire thing in about an hour. So you're not talking about a gigantic city. It wasn't big, but the walls were really high. And there was really no way to get inside the city once they locked the doors. So the people of Israel were right there at the thing that God had promised. They could see it, they could smell it, they could touch it, but they couldn't get it. They couldn't reach it. Have you ever had that feeling in your life? Like that thing that I'm looking for, that dream, that promise, that ache in my heart, that thing I've been reaching, it's right there. It's right there. I just can't seem to get it. I just can't seem to reach it. And it's amazing that we have these moments in our life, and maybe you relate to this. There's this dream or this goal or this burning desire inside of you, and when you look toward it, all you see are walls. All you see are obstacles. All you see are things in your way and hurdles you can't get over. Maybe you've decided, you say, you know what? I'm going to get out of debt. That's what I'm going to do. And maybe you've become a Dave Ramsey disciple. You may become a Dave Ramsey disciple. You've read all the books, you listen to the podcast, you listen to Debt Free Friday, and you need to do the whole thing. And the minute you set your heart and say, I'm going to honor God by being a good steward, and I'm going to get out of debt, the minute that happens, everything in your life starts to break. The car breaks, the dog goes to the animal hospital. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody's problems come in groups like mine? They have a meeting, I'm not present, and then they all come out and tell me what's going to happen. That's how problems happen. And all of a sudden, you get discouraged. Or you say, you know what? Our family is going to honor God. We are going to be at church every Sunday. We're going to raise our children in church. We're going to grow our little kids up, and our whole family's going to serve God. And your heart is set on it, and the first Sunday, you know, the alarm doesn't go off, people oversleep, everybody's running late, you get in the car, you scream at each other all the way here, you come in the middle of the middle of the worship service, and one of your kids is half dressed, and the other one has Pop-Tarts on their face, and you're thinking, this is not what I had in mind. This is not how I thought this was going to go. But you have that dream. Maybe you've had a broken relationship in your life, and you say, you know what, I want to value what God values you. I want to value people and relationships. I'm going to go and try to repair this. And in your best attempt to repair it, it gets worse. And it just heightens the conflict. And you say, what am I going to do? And you have good intentions, but things don't go well, and oftentimes we misunderstand and get discouraged and want to give up and quit because our perspective is so limited. We only see small parts of our lives and everybody else's life at one time. We can't see the whole story. But if you pull back from verse 1 says, the gates were tightly shut. No one could go in and no one could go out. But verse 2 says, I've given you Jericho. God's the only one that can speak in the past tense before the present reality comes. He's the only one that can tell you what is when what is isn't yet. Did you catch that? He's the only one that can tell you what is when what is isn't happened yet. Because he has something you and I don't have. He has perspective. And maybe you're in a situation like this morning, and God sees a different you than you see. Maybe when God looks at you, He sees you whole, but you feel broken. Maybe when God looks at you, He sees you as an overcomer, but you feel defeated. But our perspective is so limited. They didn't know. See, we know the end of the story. That's why I'm trying to hold you off the end of the story. They didn't know the end of the story. And you may say, oh, big deal. I wish all my problems would be over in a week. 7 days, I can do anything for 7 days. I mean, basically, you just get up every morning, you get dressed, you do a little 1 hour, walk around the city, you look at the architecture, you look at the wildlife, you come back, 7 days of that, and hey, man, this is no problem. About an hour a day. I wish all my problems would end like that. That's not the whole story. The children of Israel had hiked in the wilderness for 40 years before that. This isn't a 1 week story, it's a 40-year and 1 week story. See, that's perspective. That pulls the timeline out a little bit. And so let's just try to put this in modern vernacular. They're not just there in 7 days. They've been slugging this thing out for 40 years, and some of their older relatives had died when they were walking through the wilderness, and some of the next generation came up, and they've heard the stories for years about how God's going to give you the land, and how God's going to deliver you, and how God's going to break through, and how God's going to do this, and God's going to do that, and you get to the end of 40 years only to bank up against a big high wall and go, now we're just going to walk around it. This is what we did 40 years for? And I can imagine as they're trudging along out there, they're saying, God, where are you? This can't be what you promised us. Just believe God and don't give up and keep walking. But in their mind, they had to be asking, God, where? Let's just put this in a modern example. Let's just pretend that Joshua is in the 21st century Josh. And let's pretend that Josh was a drug addict and he was addicted to pornography. And let's just imagine for a minute that Josh had went into rehab and he had tried to get clean and he had been clean for a little while, but then he had fallen off the wagon again and he had tripped up again and he had spiraled down into all these problems, and it eventually cost him his job and it cost him his marriage. But then he found God in a dramatic breakthrough, and he had an encounter and he got his heart free, and then he went into rehab again, and then he learned to live it out, and he learned to live a whole life, and this happened over years, and then he got remarried to his wife and he got a job. And then we look at him sitting on the back row on Sunday morning and we go, oh man, look at the victory that guy has. And we simplify this entire process into 2 steps. Josh had a problem, God fixed the problem. End of story. But we way underestimate the process. We way underestimate the pain. We see this 1 week story when it's really a 40-year story. And we way underestimate the sacrifice and the cost and the process, and we don't understand what people go through and the sacrifices that they make to just take another step, to just get up every morning and take another step and say, God, I'm going to try one more day. I'm going to try one more time. I'm going to pray one more time. I'm going to go to church one more time. We don't understand the struggle that people go through. We just highlight it with, there was a problem, God fixed it. But it's not that simple. We don't know the story behind the story. We don't see people striving for the promise, and that's called perseverance. So why don't we give up? We give up because our perspective is limited. Number 2, we give up because our progress isn't always obvious. We might be making progress, but we can't see it. So look at verse 10 of Joshua 6. But Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. And then shout. Did you ever think about this part of the story? Don't shout on day 1, don't shout on day 2, don't shout on day 3, don't shout on day 4. Don't you shout until I tell you to shout. Until I tell you to shout, shut up and march. That's what he was telling them. Just be quiet and march. Can you imagine this whole routine? They're not talking, just doing this whole thing every day. Can you imagine how frustrating it must have felt? Not only are they doing this activity that feels completely pointless, all right, we're going to get up and we're going to walk around the wall. We're going to walk around the wall again. Now Joshua shushes them. Tells them you can't talk. I'm an extrovert, and when I grew up in school, I hated when teachers would shush you. My least favorite thing in 12 years of education was when you're in the cafeteria. Finally, you've been sitting there all day listening to them talk about math and grammar and adjectives and history and George Washington and science and all of that stuff, the periodic table, and you finally get to lunch and you get to talk, and what do? They're flipping the lights on and off. All right, let's bring the volume down. Hated it. It was cafeteria prison. What do you mean? I want to talk. I don't want to be stuck in here. I need to say, listen, these are warriors. These are people trained for battle. These are grown men. They're out leading the front of the parade. They've been trained to fight. And you're going to tell them, oh, by the way, we're not going to fight. We're just going to walk around the pretty wall. Don't you be out there talking. Shh. Shushing them. I would have broke Joshua in half. What are you talking about shushing me? I got to shush me. It's bad enough I got to walk. Can you imagine how bad it would be to try to explain what you did all day? Well, we get up in the morning, kick around the campfire, eat some breakfast, put on all of our gear like we're going to battle. We get the Ark of the Covenant, we get the ram's horn, the priest gets the robe on, we get all the instruments, we get the whole parade lined up. We march for about an hour, we come back to where we started, and that's pretty much it. That's what we call a day. Then what do? That's it. It would have been helpful if they'd had like an LED sign that would have had like day 2 of 7. Or day 3. Or like when you're playing a video game and you're about to fight a new boss and you have this level up music, you're like, oh, I'm fighting a new boss. See that music? You know why? It tells you're making progress. But they had no sense of any kind of progress, and Joshua tells them, walk in circles, end where you started, no talking. And maybe, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us, maybe one of the reasons that Joshua told them not to talk is because when we're being challenged and we're being stretched and we're persevering, sometimes our mouth can be our worst enemy. Maybe that's why he said it. Can you imagine if he'd have said, just say whatever you want to say? Can you imagine they'd have been out there grumbling? 40 years we walked in the wilderness for this. We came to fight. Just let us fight. They would have probably organized a protest and roadblocked the march. We're not going to have this. Where's God? You know what I find? The more you suffer, the louder that voice gets in your head. And you know what it says? After all I've been through, where's God? This is what God meant when he said, I'm going to break through, I'm going to see victory, I'm going to move into the future. This is what God said. And what we have to do is train ourselves to be quiet and keep marching. I have a friend who's gone to heaven now. He was an evangelist. And a few years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, his beautiful wife had a horrible brain tumor. It's very aggressive. It took her life. No warning, out of nowhere, no family history. Moved in, they did everything they could do. And man, that couple of years stretch in their life was terrible. It was dark. And as I began to go into the darkest parts of my own struggle with my wife's illness, he and I talked one day. And he said, can I just tell you something that's probably not going to sound that encouraging, but if you'll think about it, it is encouraging. He said, I didn't make it up. He said, this is something somebody told me when his wife was suffering. He said, so I want to tell you. He said, when you're walking through hell, Keep walking. Okay. You know what that's called? Perseverance. And so sometimes it's not about, can I make it to next week? Sometimes it's not about, do I have to make it till tomorrow? Sometimes you just have to tell yourself to be quiet and pick your foot up and put it down one more time and take one more step. Because God didn't call you to conquer next year. He didn't call you to conquer next month. He didn't call you to conquer tomorrow. Sometimes you just have to put your gear on and quiet your mouth and spirit down, and sometimes you just got to take another step. Sometimes you have to preach to your own soul and say, be quiet and keep walking. Be quiet and just keep showing up. But I don't understand. And what about this? And why is it this happening? And where is God? And what does this mean? And why does the Bible say that? And why can't I reconcile what I see with what's going on? Be quiet and start marching. Just be quiet and keep showing up. That's what perseverance is. Sometimes you have to preach to your own soul and say, I don't trust the circumstances, I don't trust my emotions, and I don't trust my flesh. I'm going to make a decision today to take one step and only one step because it's the only step that I can take. I'm going to take a step and I'm going to trust God. And that's the step. God told Joshua, listen to this. This is one of my favorite parts of the story. God told Joshua, hey, you're going to march 7 days, and then the walls are going to fall. This is so interesting to me. Joshua never told the people that. I'm frustrated at Joshua. He's shushing them. He's turning the lunch lights on and off, and he's not even telling them what's going to happen. I want to know how many days it's going to be. Why did he not tell them how many days? I don't know. As far as the people know, they're getting up every morning, they're putting their junk on, and they're like a part of an eternal marching band. They're just going to march. They did 40 years. How do they know this isn't going to be 40 years? Oh, great. We did 40 years in the wilderness. Now our new 40 years is around this brick wall. I don't know about you. God did not make my personality for monotony. I'm not built for monotony. I'm not built for get up and do the same thing, the same way, the same time, the same every day. I would die. And I want to talk about it. So there had to be somebody in the group with a personality like mine, at least one. Like I'm telling you, when the walls fell, I think I would go up and just punch Joshua and say, you knew all the time it was 7 days and you didn't tell us? Because if you know how long it's going to be, it's encouraging. You know, if I told you, hey, listen, you're going to lose your job, but if you just figure out how to survive until January 1st, I'll give you $1 billion. You know what? You'd figure it out. You would figure it out. You know why? Because you know how long it's going to last, but it's so frustrating when you're suffering and there's no end in sight. It's so frustrating when you're doing the right thing. It's so frustrating when you get up every day and you put the right gear on and you get the Ark of the Covenant and you get the ram's horn and you get the instruments and you get the priest's robes and you get all lined up and you do the whole ritual. You do everything you know to do the best way you know to do it, and it makes no difference. It makes zero difference. Nothing gets better, nothing improves, nothing changes. It's so frustrating. But when you can see progress, you start to get encouraged. But this is what they did. They marched around the wall over and over and over and over and over with nothing. If you knew your spouse's depression would end by Christmas, you'd figure it out. You'd be like, okay. All right, it's bad. It's bad. It's real bad, but we're going to make it. If you had some chronic health issue and somebody could tell you in 6 weeks it'll be gone, you're like, okay. All right, it's bad, but I can make it for 6 weeks. But their progress was not obvious. They didn't know where the finish line was, so they kept marching and kept marching and kept marching and kept marching. And you know the story. In 7 days, the walls came down. And we all say, yeah, and then they were allowed to shout. I'd have been going, yeah! They were like, finally, I can let it out. And they were able to shout Because the walls came down, the obstacle was over, the promise has been seen physically now. They've taken the city that God told them he was going to give them. It wasn't 40 years, it was 7 days. Man, there's this gush of victory. So our feeling is to say, wow, story's over. Just like the story wasn't 1 week long and there were 40 years before it, Joshua doesn't end in chapter 6. There's a chapter 7. And the story doesn't end there. So number 3, sometimes we quit when we reach for something God didn't promise us. Now, I almost didn't include this point because it's complicated. You know what, though? I put it in because I found out something. Life's complicated. And so what happened is God promised to give Israel Jericho. And so they went and took it. Great, no problem. But God said to them, the plunder from the city is not yours. It belongs to the Lord. And everybody was cool with that, except a few people. And a man named Achan, when they were breaking down the plunder, saw some of these beautiful, sparkly things, and he snuck them out, and he took them back to his tent, and he dug a hole under his tent, and he buried them there because he wanted them for himself. Now, how does that cause discouragement? Well, if you read Joshua chapter 7, because of his disobedience, because of him trying to reach for something that God never promised him, it created a mess. 36 men died in battle because of that action. 36 men. It unleashed incredible suffering on that group of people and their families and the army, and Achan and several other people ended up being stoned to death. It unleashed an absolute mess. God promised them Jericho. He didn't promise them the plunder. He said, don't get the plunder. So sometimes we reach for things that God doesn't promise us. And the point I want you to see today is when you reach for something that God didn't promise you, you create a mess. You create an absolute mess. And then when you create a mess, you know what you do? You get discouraged and you blame God, and then you quit pursuing God. Sometimes you hear people say, I'm just believing God. I'm just believing God for that house right there. 5-bedroom, 3 garage, swimming pool, gazebo, 2 acres, 4-wheel trails, canopy. Believing God for that right there. What if God didn't promise you that? I mean, I know I can't afford it, but I'm believing God for it. I think if you can't afford it, you're believing God for the wrong thing. See, God didn't promise us a dream job. He didn't promise us our dream house. God didn't promise us comfort. He didn't promise us to avoid all sadness in life. He didn't promise us a life where we would never get discouraged. He didn't promise us the American dream. He didn't promise that we would avoid all emotions like sadness and grief and fear and discomfort. He didn't promise us that. But I think sometimes we confuse the American dream with God's promises. And we think if we just persevere long enough, our life will turn out exactly the way that we wanted it to. But here's what I want you to know. Every miracle you pray for is not going to happen. Every pain you hope to avoid, you will not avoid. Every person you pray for is not going to go to heaven. Some parts of life end in sadness. Now stay with me. What do we do then? Here's what you do. Watch. Persevere. Persevere. If you think that God's called you to a life to build perseverance that requires no resistance, you don't need perseverance, you just need a recliner. That's how perseverance happens. A few years ago, when I was at a very low point, I told my spiritual director, I said, I would quit if I knew where the quitting line was. I don't know where to go to sign up to quit. I wish I could. I wish I could find it. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. Because I was out. I was out of emotional energy. I was out of physical energy. I was tired. I was done hurting. I was done with pain. I was overwhelmed. I had given everything that I had to give, and I had no more. But life kept demanding more from me. And so here's what I did. I found this little passage in the New Testament that said there's this widow woman that kept coming to God and kept beating on the door and kept knocking on the door and knocking on the door. And the Bible says because she kept coming, the door was going to open. And so I used that scripture and I said, okay, God, look, I'm not even defining what for you to do. Heal my wife, help me. I'm not even giving you specifics. Here's what I'm saying. I'm going to come and I'm going to beat on this door until I beat the door down, and I'm going to pray every day, and I'm going to pray until you do something. So I did that. I did that for 6 months. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. No breakthrough, no relief, no help, no miracle, no change. Nothing that I could physically see ever changed. So you know what I did one day? I showed up and I quit. And I said, God, I quit. I quit. I'm not praying that passage anymore. I'm not praying that verse anymore. I quit. And you know what I learned that I didn't know? Watch, here's what I learned. I learned that I was trying to reach for a promise God never gave me. I was trying to force God to do something God never promised me He would do. I was trying to force God to work. I didn't know that at the time, but that's what I was trying to do. So I quit. I quit trying to force God to work, and I started to just show up. And so I would show up for a while, and I'd show up and say, God, I quit. Then the next day I showed up again and said, God, I quit again. Then the next day I showed up and said, God, it's me again, and I'm still quitting because I'm tired, and you're not doing anything that I can see, and I don't know what else to do, so I'm just quit again. Here's the thing, though. I kept giving my resignation letter to God. I kept quitting to Him. Perseverance is not about you making God do something you think He should do. Perseverance is about showing up even when you see Him do nothing. That's what perseverance is. So I've learned some stuff about quitting. I have my degree in quitting. I want to share a couple of insights with you this morning that I learned about quitting. And I'm going to share with you what I learned that quitting is not. Because I think there's a lot of things that we think quitting is that it's not. And here's some of them. Quitting's not being discouraged. Just because you're discouraged doesn't mean you quit. Quitting is not having questions that you can't find the answer to. Because life's hard, and there's some hard things that happen. There's some hard things going on in some of your lives this morning. And you know what? Quitting's not knowing the answer. Just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean you quit. Quitting's not dealing with difficult emotions like anger, sadness, grief, and fear. Just because you feel painful emotions doesn't mean that you've quit. Quitting is not living in your limits. Just because you've limited your life and limited your output and limited your activity to what you can bear doesn't mean that you quit. This next one's a big one. Quitting is not disappointing other people. Just because you disappoint other people doesn't mean you quit. Can I tell you, I felt like my life for about 3 or 4 years, I was one big walking apology. I'm sorry I can't respond. I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm sorry I couldn't respond to your email. I'm sorry I didn't call you back. I'm sorry I didn't text you. I'm sorry I couldn't be at the party. I'm sorry I couldn't go to the meeting. I'm sorry I couldn't follow through like I should have been able to follow through. I'm sorry. And that's a hard life to live because you live under the weight that you're just disappointing people all the time. But you know what I learned about this is? Other people's disappointment is not your quitting. Doesn't mean you quit. Quitting is not having unmet expectations. Having unmet expectations is discouraging, but it's not quitting. Quitting's not being overwhelmed. You might feel overwhelmed today. Just because you feel overwhelmed doesn't mean you quit. Quitting is not being unable to meet the expectations on your own life. You might not actually have the resources to match the requirements on your life, and it doesn't mean you quit. It doesn't mean that you've quit just because you're coming up short. Quitting is not wanting to quit, feeling like quitting, or quitting and then starting again. I've resigned 100 times. I just keep starting again. Quitting's not making the wrong decisions, the wrong choices. Everybody makes wrong choices sometimes, and just because you do doesn't mean you quit. Quitting's not taking a break or taking time for rest and renewal. Quitting is not changing strategies. Quitting is not transitioning into a new role. Sometimes you have to reposition yourself, and you have to rethink, and you have to re-strategize, you have to replan, and you have to pivot, and you have to do things in a different way than other people do them, because your life is different than everybody else's life maybe around you, and you have to reposition yourself to keep moving. And that doesn't mean that you quit. None of these things are quitting, they're part of the journey. All right, I'm going to give you a definition this morning. Look, all that I just read you, I made all of that up. It's not in the Bible. It's not, take it for what it's worth. It's what it cost you. I'm going to give you my definition of quitting. I've told you all the things quitting's not. I want to give you my definition of quitting. Quitting is giving up on God. When you give up on God, you quit. Even though I quit a bunch of times, I always quit to God. I quit to Him. I gave it to Him. I said, God, I quit. I quit. But I was still talking to Him. So I guess, even though I didn't know it at the time, I haven't given up on Him. And I do think we have some scriptural basis for this, because Paul the Apostle, who was imprisoned, who was shipwrecked, who was beaten, who was stoned, and who was abandoned, when he defined perseverance, I want to show you how he defined it in one of the last chapters he ever wrote in the New Testament. I want to show you how he defined it. In 2 Timothy 4:7, he said, I have fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith. I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I kept the faith. He didn't say, I was the greatest apostle in the New Testament. He didn't say, I planted more churches than any leader in the New Testament. He didn't say, I wrote more letters in the New Testament than any other author. You know what he said? After all I've been through, I've been in prison, I've been shipwrecked, I've been abandoned, I've been beaten. But you know what? It never beat my faith out of me. I kept the faith. I kept the faith. And I've been through some things I never thought I'd go through. But I kept the faith. And if that definition of perseverance is good enough for Paul the Apostle, it's good enough for me. So I just want to say it this morning. I just want to state it. I want to state it categorically, I want to state it emphatically, and I want to state it clearly. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe that Jesus is God's only Son. I believe that Jesus lived a perfect and a sinless life. I believe that He taught. I believe He was baptized. I believe that He performed miracles. I believe that He was crucified. I believe that He died. I believe on the third day He rose from the dead. I believe He ascended to the Father. I believe He sent the Holy Spirit to fill me and you and His church with His presence. And I believe that He's at the right hand of the Father interceding for me today. That's what I believe. I want to keep my faith. You may look around and say, man, I got a friend that deconstructed. I've got a friend that doesn't believe. I got a family member, my kids, my mom, my spouse, my this, my that. Man, I went through this. There's this person we prayed for. We wanted them to be healed. They were never healed. I don't know, maybe God's not real. There's so many. Man, I heard this guy on YouTube. I read this book. There's this new guy from Harvard, this new really intellectual. And man, he describes how, half the Bible's not true. There's all of the conversation going on around you. But let me encourage you, if you want to persevere, keep the faith. Keep the faith. Keep the faith. That's what victory looks like. So as you stand with me this morning, man, life's not perfect, but God is good. And if you persevere, you will see the goodness of God. If you persevere, if you keep marching, if you keep walking, if you put your gear on and put one foot in front of the other, you will see the goodness of God. So would you just close your eyes with me for a moment? God, today we declare your goodness. You are good. You are good. That doesn't mean I can explain everything I see. It doesn't mean I understand every pain I have. It doesn't mean I can answer every question in life. It just means you're good. And even when I don't understand, I'm going to keep walking around the wall. And even when I don't know how many days it's going to be, I'm going to keep walking around the wall. Because some of you are on day 6 and tomorrow's 7 and you just don't know it. But keep walking. God, today we set our eyes on your goodness. As our worship team is coming, they're going to lead us in this song. And what I want you to do is I want you to just open your heart and open your soul and lift your eyes. And I want you just to focus on the goodness of God. God, show us now. Show us your goodness. In Jesus' name.